Gary Taubes said something along the lines of, we cut fat and got fatter and sicker, so we picked the wrong macronutrient. So we need to cut carbs now. What do you think about this statement?
So I suspect Mr. Taubes has good intentions, but he's a bad historian, at least in terms of nutrition, because we never cut fat. So this relates to the comment I was just making about the difference between advice we get and what we do with the advice. So there was advice, and again, it originated around the middle of the 20th century, inspired initially by the work of Ancel Keys, but then picked up by William Castelli at Harvard, the Framingham study, and ultimately a large body of evidence suggesting that there were ills of diets high in fat, specifically saturated fat. And there was all kinds of advice to reduce our intake, preferentially of saturated fat. It did get generalized to just cut fat, because by cutting fat, since so much of our fat was coming from saturated fat, the thinking presumably was if you cut fat in general, you'll be cutting fat from the sources that are providing most of it: meat and fatty meat, dairy and processed dairy. So the advice was to cut fat. The response of big food was to generate an entirely new suite of low-fat junk foods. I often think of Snackwell cookies as the flag bearer, but there are, basically a huge portfolio of fat-reduced foods that weren't good for us. They just were reduced in fat. And so what the typical American did in response to this is start buying those foods, thinking there was a license to eat as much of those as you wanted, and actually reducing dietary fat intake almost not at all. So we have data from this era, from both the CDC and the USDA, so we have independent data sources, some of them looking at what people were eating, and some of them looking at what industry was managing to sell. So the movement of calories through the system to us tracked at both ends. And both of these data sources corroborated that intake of fat in the US pretty much stayed the same. Didn't go down. What happened was we increased our intake of total calories because we were eating more highly refined carbohydrate, Snackwell cookies and all the rest. So if you think about percent of calories from a given source, there's two ways to lower the percent of calories you get from fat. There is the sensible way, the intended way, and then there's the American way. The sensible way would be to actually eat a bit less fat, and had we done that and shifted to wholesome whole foods low in fat, vegetables, fruits, whole grains, beans, and lentils, all would have been well. But then there's the American way. We don't like less, we like more. The American way was if we just eat more other stuff and grow the denominator, more total calories, the ratio of calories we're getting from fat to the total calories we're consuming will go down. That is what happened. We never cut fat, we increased our total intake of calories. Fat stayed fairly constant, even went up a little bit. Saturated fat did go down just a little bit, but again, we're talking about very negligible shifts. There was a significant increase in average total calorie consumption, with the excess coming from added sugar and highly refined carbohydrate, both bad actors. And so, yeah, we got fatter and sicker. So you look at that scenario and say, we cut fat and got fatter and sicker, we picked the wrong macronutrient. No, we never cut fat. We got advice to cut fat. That advice was corrupted by the food industry into, as long as we call it low fat, we can sell them anything. We bought what they were selling. We ate even more. We got fatter and sicker. And then, because the logic was flawed, oh, we picked the wrong macronutrient, let's do this with carbohydrate, we did it again. There's a famous aphorism, those who don't learn from the follies of history are destined to repeat them. So the idea that we could find one nutrient scapegoat should have dissuaded us from trying to do it again because it didn't go so well, but we were talked into doing it again by Mr. Taubes, among others. He helped to elevate the profile of the Atkins diet back in the day. But as bad as I think the Atkins diet was, it was still limited to actual food. So Atkins was recommending eat more meat and eat more dairy. He wasn't recommending low-carb brownies because those hadn't been invented yet. But he was exploited in exactly the way that Ancel Keys was exploited. So as soon as there was widespread interest in low-carb eating, Big Food stepped up again and said, another golden opportunity. We can now invent a vast variety of low-carb junk foods, And since it comes under the halo of the fad of the day, low carb, they'll eat it up. And we did. So you could make the same argument about the low carb advice, which is now 20 years old, that was being levied at the low fat advice. We did this, and yet everybody's fatter and sicker. Well, we can say it equally about both, but it's because in both cases, the message was co-opted, corrupted, and the original advice was never followed. Now, I happen to think the advice to cut saturated fat was good advice. The advice to cut carbohydrate per se is silly because every plant food is a source of carbohydrate. It's just way too big an expanse of the food supply. But should we cut bad carbohydrate, refined starches and added sugars? Absolutely. We should eat whole, wholesome foods, and then all the bad stuff goes away. But that's the main problem with the worldview of Gary Taubes and others who tell this story. We never followed any of the sensible advice that was in the mix. We always played into the hands of big food, big profit, and pick any nutrient you like, that opportunity is replicated. We're seeing it yet again with gluten-free. There's widespread interest in gluten. So now there's a vast array of gluten-free junk foods. You know, deja vu all over again.